Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing some misleading language from the campaign to keep Washington's carbon auction, Seattle police telling residents that they're on their own because they're not responding to many 911 calls starting next month, the head of Washington's public schools saying they need billions of dollars in the next budget, and hints that an income tax is the way to get it, and Spokane expecting their budget hole to widen in coming years. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. It's well established that voters should take campaign statements with a grain of salt. But where is the line between half-truths and outright lies? Investigative reporter TJ Martinell received an email this week from the campaign fighting to keep the state's Climate Commitment Act and its multi-billion-dollar carbon auction intact that had some curious claims that are meant to dissuade against voting in favor of a ballot proposition to scrap it. What got your attention, TJ?
I think what got my attention in the email is the line that it would, quote, cut billions in investments in transportation, slashing transit, and putting road and bridge projects at risk. So they're effectively implying that there are road and bridge projects that will not be conducted if this initiative is passed.
Now, and it seems like the main discrepancy is the distinction between construction money, which in the state of Washington is money to patch potholes, build bridges, keep bridges from having that infamous failing grade and allusions to the bridge collapses in Minnesota years ago, and carbon auction funding, which also has its own set of guardrails, correct?
Yeah, so this is the distinction that really needs to be made and clarified is that there's funding for maintenance and preservation. This is where you're either replacing bridges or roads or you're repaving them. And so the issue that's going on is that the Climate Commitment Act funding cannot go to those type of projects. It can only go to carbon-related or environmentally related projects.
And in that distinction, we've discussed this before when talking about this, and it came up during the budget conversations where we asked Governor Jay Inslee's office, and they made that distinction.
Right. Inslee's office said that the law is very clear about the use of CCA funding, what is allowed and not allowed. And they said maintenance and preservation are not appropriate uses. It has to be for direct climate and decarbonization benefits. So they're openly saying this stuff cannot be used for regular transportation projects.
So are they outright lying? I mean, is this a complete mistruth, or is the devil in the details here with this statement?
Well, when they say road and bridge projects, what are they referring to? If they're referring to projects where they're replacing bridges or maintaining them so that they don't fall apart, that's one thing. But if they're building a bike lane or some sort of environmentally friendly thing on a bridge, calling it a road and bridge project or saying it's going to put it at risk, most people aren't going to be thinking of that. And that's where the vagueness and the very general description of these projects can cause people to misunderstand what's being communicated. So, and this is not the only time this has happened. There have been state lawmakers who have tried to push the whole notion that if the Climate Commitment Act is repealed, that transportation funding will be undermined. Well, that is technically correct because transportation is such a broad general topic that merely painting stripes for a bike lane on a road is a transportation project, the same way that replacing a crumbling bridge is a transportation project. However, what they don't say is that CCA funding can only be used for specific projects.
Right. That do not typically fall under the layman's definition of transportation funding, filling potholes, building new roads, fixing bridges.
And this is also at a time when funding for maintenance and preservation is in a shortfall of I think $1 billion annually. WSDOT has repeatedly said that it's not that they don't lack the money, it's that money's being prioritized for other stuff.
They have more money now than they ever have, and yet they're still running short on this. And Inslee got on them about this, right? He said, stop prioritizing this other new bells and whistles and fix our roads.
Yeah, Inslee has been a proponent of trying to do maintenance and preservation over new projects, and he actually protested in the latest transportation budget when he signed it, saying, I'm signing this reluctantly, but this is stuff that needs to occur, is the maintenance and preservation. And so that all needs to be understood when people are talking about repealing the CCA, what it would do and what it wouldn't do. What it's not going to do is it's not going to cause potholes to not get filled. So, and it's not going to prevent the construction of a new bridge. It's not going to prevent the repair and maintenance of an existing bridge or road or highway. It's not going to prevent a new lane from being added to Highway 2 somewhere.
Now, are there laws against, even not necessarily the gray area, but if I say, politician X is, injures puppies for fun on the weekend in a campaign ad, are there laws in Washington against that?
Not to my knowledge. I think that the only thing that would really apply is defamation of character or libel. So that would apply. Now, granted, public figures, it's a little bit different from private figures. And this is all federal law, I believe. But First Amendment, free speech, people are allowed to say stuff. And as long as, I think the thing is that you can be technically correct, but misleading. And I think that that's what a lot of campaign ads do, is that they run this line where they can say something that they know most people are going to think of something else other than what they're actually saying. But when they get called out on it, they can go back to saying, well, we weren't referencing that. We were referencing this. We weren't referencing road construction. We were referencing bike lane or public transit.
Technically correct, but misleading is probably on many a campaign consultant's business card, to be quite honest. It would not shock me at all. Thank you, TJ. If you own a home security system and you're stirred from bed in your Seattle home, the police coming up soon, aren't just going to show up because you or the ADT operator called 911. That's the jarring change Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly covered this week in the Emerald City. Spencer, what's a guy got to do to get a squad car in front of his house in Seattle nowadays?
He's going to have to do a little bit more than prior. Any calls regarding alarm activations will have to include evidence now. This means any audio or video of the break-in or eyewitness accounts as the scene is going on, which can be kind of interesting to think about. I know some of these home defense companies will reach out to a homeowner or property owner to confirm an illegal entry is occurring. But obviously, this decision could raise some eyebrows of property owners in some of Seattle's neighborhoods where crime is more frequent.
When does it take effect?
So this new policy goes into effect starting October 1st, but interim Seattle Police Chief Sue Rahr informed home defense companies of the upcoming policy change on September 13th. So there has been time to kind of warn homeowners about this.
Why is SPD saying this is a change that they need to make?
Well, Chief Rahr would point to the data. In this letter, she pointed to last year in 2023, there were 13,000 alarm calls from these home defense systems, but only about 4% of those resulted in having some kind of crime associated with it. Now, a lot of these things can be due to old technology or just the property owners or employees of these commercial buildings accidentally tripping the sensor. And current policy has police officers having to respond to these calls no matter what. But Chief Rahr also mentions that, these calls take away from SPD officers' times, especially as the department continues to struggle with the staffing shortage. So we're seeing a lot of response times go up for priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 calls. So when you have these calls go, it takes away the resources for more important crimes, I suppose.
Right. I mean, as if I'm a Seattle resident, knowledge of this has to be absolutely terrifying. Because and granted, they do get a lot of literal false alarms, like you've said. But if I am now awakened by my alarm going off, like you said, I have to go and get firsthand somehow witness that I have an active intruder, trying to break into my home, or someone is trying to steal my car.
You better be quick about it too, you know?
Right. And it's like, I'm putting, they're telling you that you must put yourself in potential danger in order to confirm that police actually do need to respond to the call with their already slowed response times.
Cole, if I could just say, like, even when you look at the data, when it just says 4% of these calls result in something, that's 4% of calls where in the future it's going to be a little bit tougher to to work on these cases or be in situations where it's dangerous,
right? And
have some police officer respond. It just causes more stress for homeowners having to think about that.
And 4% of the total is still
13,000.
Is still hundreds of real serious calls. I don't want to be one of those hundreds.
Me neither. And as someone who lives in Seattle, I don't have home defense system, but if I did, I would feel like what's the point in having this?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and then it also begs the question: do Seattle residents start then looking into, home defense? If I know that there's a good chance after October 1st that if my security system goes off and I'm not willing to go down there and look the person in the eye that's trying to break into my home or is already in the home, my other options, do I then look into home defense, maybe a firearm? I wonder how many people are going to see this message and think, well, okay, help is not on the way.
Yeah, it's all hands on deck. It's on me now to protect myself, my family, and my home or my property, whatever may have you, is something to definitely consider. And that's something that I think about when I first read this. This is a service that you pay monthly for, these home defense systems. So now, instead, you just pay a one-time fee for a firearm and to protect yourself and have that kind of peace of mind that there's something that you can use to prevent yourself from harm's way.
Right.
Especially in a big city like Seattle.
I mean, until they start making insurance payments on firearms mandatory, there's no monthly charge for exercising your Second Amendment rights. But Thank you, Spencer. Sleep well, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Public schools across the country have called for more funding since my parents were walking into country schoolhouses. Some states provide more funding than others, but even the most well-heeled districts in the country often make a play for even more funding, and Washington is no different. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson covered the head of the state's schools this week with what he called a bold plan. Carlene, describe Mr. Reichdahl's vision.
Yeah, so State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Chris Reichdahl, who's running currently for a third term in that position. He says public schools across Washington state, we've got 295 public school districts, need an influx of taxpayer dollars to the tune of, drumroll please, he says we're shortchanging them about $4 billion, that's a B, every year. And he wants to close what he calls the K-12 funding gap with an initial influx for the upcoming legislative session of $2.9 billion, again, there's the B, for the next 2-year budget cycle.
Now, Washington is no slouch when it comes to public funding for schools, especially compared to other states. You have other, in the SEC, you have states like Arkansas, Mississippi, who are perennially spending lower amounts because, well, one, they allow that burden to be placed more on local property taxes, especially Illinois, who's a big offender of that. But also, it's cheaper. Teachers don't get paid as much in those states because the cost of living is lower. But Washington is a different story. I believe they're fourth or seventh or something like that in terms of total public school spending per student. Yeah,
$18,354 per student on average in the state. Now, of course, based on local levies, you might have a little bit more, you might have a little bit less. But you mentioned teacher salaries and that kind of a thing. And that does play into it, right? Because salaries are determined through collective bargaining and other stuff, but the state allocates a big chunk of change for teachers. And I love teachers. I'm not going to say they should make less money, whatever. But this is now the latest numbers I have for teacher salaries, which is the biggest chunk of money that goes to the districts for the 22-23 school year. The average teacher in Washington state, when you add in salary and their benefits, $134,913. Now, average administrator, $211,551 in salary and benefits. Now, that's a year and a half old now, those numbers.
And you make a great point about the administration. I've seen reports in recent years that have said the number of teachers is not expanding, but the number of per district administrators is exploding. And with that average payroll cost benefits of more than $200,000 in a state like Washington, it doesn't surprise me, frankly. And I think that that's an important part of it. But Carlene, one thing too, I wonder is in the years after the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, from the federal government across the country going to schools in what they called COVID aid, to make sure that in an effort to get kids back into school, but what they were really worried about was spreading the COVID virus. They sent so much money, and it was largely unsupervised. We had found later how these schools spent this money. As long as they had it allocated and there was a receipt of some kind, they could keep this money and continue to spend it at will. I mean, gyms, swimming pools, as long as there was some kind of documentation, they typically would get away with it. There was very few instances in any capacity of the federal government clawing back that COVID funding. I wonder, my question for you, and I think you've seen this in schools around the state, that COVID money is running dry and the school districts are unwilling to constrict back down to a reasonable level where they no longer need that extra funding. And they're going to their municipalities, to the state, saying, we have a massive budget hole.
Well, I liken it, Cole, to, on a much smaller scale, of course, right? We got the checks. We got the checks
right.
And we went, oh, well, now I've got another $1,200 for this quarter or whatever. I don't even remember what it was. Or they sent your kid the EBT card, right? For go to the grocery store. Yes. This is to feed your kid. Right. And so suddenly you're like, we can buy steaks instead of hamburger this month. I mean, it's that kind of mindset for the districts because a lot of them relied heavily on those federal COVID dollars for teacher salary increases.
Yep.
Hiring of a bunch of paraeducators and then social workers. That money ran dry.
Yeah.
But in a state like Washington, where the Washington Education Association, one of the most powerful teacher unions in the entire nation, they're not going to go back and say, okay,
you gave us these raises and we will strike to make sure that we keep that level of compensation. Now, one thing that Reichdahl had said in his push for this, his bold vision,
You're not going to income tax, are you, Cole?
Yeah, I am going there because that is the one thing that businesses and rankings across the country have always said is Washington State's saving grace. And the superintendent of public instruction said, we should look at an income tax.
Yeah. And that came up in a couple of reporter questions after the Monday press conference. Basically, they said, well, how are you going to pay for all this? $2.9 billion additional dollars to get us up to speed. And a lot of it is special education and things nobody wants to argue with. Transportation, right? We've got school bus issues. But he was asked directly about tax sources and asked if he could support an income tax. And he said, I could support that if voters approve of it. Of course, it would require, two-thirds vote of the legislature to change the state constitution.
Right.
But he was very clear, and it was all over the news all this week. But he kind of couched that a little bit, Cole, by saying if other taxes are reduced. In other words,
understanding the gravity of what he had just admitted, he then took about 6 steps back. But yes,
whoa!
Understanding that he had stepped on the third rail and tried to make sure that it was filled with only ifs and buts. But thank you, Carlene. Appreciate it. We'll be curious to see how his bold vision pans out. Speaking of deficits, the city of Spokane says its budget hole is being managed, but that's only in the short term. City officials are now telling council members that the next few years could see even more of a shortfall. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser covered this warning. What's the reason the city is saying they're facing a shortfall, Tim?
Yeah, Cole. Well, it's important to recognize that this is a tax revenue shortfall, not to be mistaken for the city's overarching deficit. City Council's budget director hinted earlier this week that Spokane is anticipating some significant sales tax shortfalls of up to potentially $35 million, which she said is fueling the city's deficit. It sounds like a lot, but the data is kind of misconstrued, which Mayor Brown's administration pointed out afterwards. While the city expected to have collected that extra $35 million by September 20th, they won't actually collect for the period of the last 3 months for another few weeks. The city told me they collect every 3 months, so they don't have any of the data since around June. But that doesn't mean that once they do collect that they'll be out of trouble. The last administration projected revenue growth this year ranging from 2 to 3%. And that's not happening. Spokane CFO said at the same time that once the new administration came in, he adjusted the growth from around 3% down to 0.3%. And now the city is currently at 0.4%. So they're right above their adjusted projection. Now, once they collect for this period, the CFO said it will likely bridge some of that gap, but not all of it. And he did mention that he's pretty concerned about it and that the city is walking a thin line right now.
Right. And now, to her credit, Mayor Brown is cutting a pretty sizable amount of her, operating budget at this point, right? But that's not necessarily reflecting moving forward.
Yeah, when Mayor Brown took office, the general fund deficit was around $25 million, but the general fund reserves were also depleted by nearly $21 million. They referred to it as a $50 million deficit or structural gap for the first few months she was in office, and then they changed tune in July, referring to it then as a $25 million structural gap. Now, over the last few months, she's whittled away at the deficit, taking it from $25 million down to $10.9 million with all of her cost-saving measures. So she's made significant progress, but they're not quite there. Next week, she's going to release her preliminary budget, so we could see the deficit close altogether, but the question is at what cost? But it's important to mention, like you said before, the deficit is expected to increase, but we don't know by how much. In that July budget meeting, the CFO said that, look, going into 2025, we expect the deficit to decrease. But over the next biennium, so 2026 and 2027, it's likely to increase again by a few million. So while the deficit could reduce to 10.9 million or potentially be eliminated altogether, they do expect somewhat of a deficit over the biennium due to these tax revenue shortfalls. Now, that's relying on projections. All that could change, but that's what they're thinking as of right now.
Well, and governmental budgets, are a lot like a small business in that you project what you're going to get in revenue based on previous performance. So that's, a lot of it is really tricky in that regard. And we've seen states and municipalities and counties always kind of fidget with those numbers a little bit to make their, in certain state cases where the Constitution says, well, you must have a balanced budget. It is a constitutional requirement. Well, they'll just say, well, we expect to earn much more money, so we're going to spend much more. But in terms of what the mayor is doing at this point, it's impressive. You've documented this pretty much every step of the way, and I'm really curious to see her incoming preliminary budget with the reductions that she's made in a relatively short amount of time. But she has been very outspoken about the need to put on a ballot measure that succeeds in earning more tax revenue from homeowners. Is this, in terms of the narrative that she's building, is this just a way to build that argument for, well, we're being responsible, but we just need a little bit more tax revenue to close the gap?
Yeah, Cole, it kind of does sound like that. I think you'll remember from a few months ago, Brown said when she took office and a little bit after that, to close this deficit, voters would have to pass her $40 million property tax levy. And if they didn't, around 200 people would lose their jobs, significantly impacting public safety. That didn't go over too well with voters, and she ended up pulling the measure from the ballot just a few weeks later and opted to replace it with a much smaller sales tax instead. Now, the city is pushing this tax as a way to provide new investments, not to close the deficit. But if you look at the intended uses for the sales tax revenue, it's primarily going towards investments that the city cut because of the deficit, because they were funded by the general fund. So it's clear that the mayor is pushing for this sales tax. Will it pass in November? We'll just have to wait and see.
Who knows? Yeah. Once it gets in the account, money's fungible, right? Campaign promises, like we had mentioned with TJ. Thank you, Tim. And a big thank you to our journalists for sharing their stories today. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach. And until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.